Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Julie Watkins, and I'll be helping with today's Travelogue brought to you by the Geographic Society of Chicago. Since 1898, the Geographic Society of Chicago has educated the public about geography and its important uses. Today's GSC trains students in the latest geospatial technology. Together, our board and membership provide educational opportunities for students and educators, assist in building geographic materials collections in educational and cultural institutions, promote new and emerging technologies and problem solving, and much more. If you're familiar with our Travelogue series, you know that pre-pandemic, we hosted these each month at the Chicago Cultural Center, but have been on Zoom since March 2020. So yeah, we can't get together physically at the moment, but the GSC is committed to remaining connected with its members and supporters. And now our Travelogue series is webinars. So please make sure to share any feedback you have with us. With us to present today is Madison Robley. She is currently pursuing her master's in urban resilience and sustainability from CU Boulder and obtained her bachelor's from Washington University in St. Louis in anthropology. In 2019, she got a grant from National Geographic to do an anthropological study in Nepal, which is what she'll be presenting on today.
So in my presentation, I'm going to be sharing some photos, some stories I learned, and then a bit about my personal experience in Nepal as well. And so I think that this might be a bit different from the other travelogues that you've heard in the past. Mine was going to be pretty focused on the work that I did. And so I'm going to try to make it as engaging as possible, but I do have a tendency to get a bit in the weeds, and I definitely need to be reined in at times. So give me a shout if that is the case. Well, then with that, I will get started. And so I am going to start by telling you about a festival that I attended at a pond in my neighborhood in Kathmandu. So when I arrived at this pond, my Nepali brother, Dinesh, helped me onto a raft to join the rest of my Nepali family and a group of other worshippers. So we pushed off from the banks of this pond, its banks hazy with smoke and packed shoulder to shoulder with people placing leaf plates, heaping with offerings in view of a massive gilded snake that rose from the center of the urban pond. Suddenly, a woman seated just in front of me on the raft began to convulse. Her eyes were squeezed shut and she shook her head and hissed loudly. I looked around frantically, like, do we need to call a doctor? When suddenly another woman, similarly possessed, jumped from the raft and into the water. The fabric of her sari spread around her as she floated on the surface. At this point, I will say I was fully freaking out. I turned to my Nepali sister, Amisha, but she just shrugged. She's like, oh, this happens on Nag Panchami. So she was like, yeah, during Nag Panchami, the Nagas, or the snake spirits, inhabit the bodies of the people around us to communicate with us. And so I'm telling you this story for a couple reasons. One is that I think it illustrates the ways that a lot of ways of life in Nepal are probably pretty different from what you may have experienced. And another reason is that the history of Nag Panchami in Kathmandu, which is a Hindu holiday that's celebrated every August, is a foundational part of the city's history, especially in its connection with water resources. So the day is meant to celebrate the Nagas, or the snake spirits, who are said to be the original inhabitants of Kathmandu Valley. And at this time, it was said to have been a massive lake. And so to appease the Nagas, a wise man is said to have cut a gorge into the southern end of the valley to drain it. And the people who could now live and farm in the area built these ponds around the city called Pokari, all around Kathmandu as places for the Nagas to live. So these ponds, like the one that I visited on Nag Panchami, continue to be an essential part of the urban landscape, not only for their place in the mythology, but also as essential sites for water source revitalization. So you might be like me, and I will admit that before I went to Nepal, I could barely point to it on a map. And that was pretty fine. I did not know anything about the country other than that it was mountainous. I knew about Mount Everest, but I decided that it would be a good place to study abroad when I was a junior in college. So in 2018, I flew 8,000 miles across the world from my home in St. Louis to spend 4 months in Kathmandu. And at that time, I had no idea how much the experience would shape my life, that I would go a second time in 2019 for almost a year, or that Nepal would become my second home. So here is an elevation map of the country. You can see that Nepal is small. It's just a little bit bigger than the state of Tennessee. But despite its small size, it has a population of about 30 million and has some of the most cultural and ecological diversity in the world. In less than 100 miles, you can go from sea level at the Indian border to the top of some of the tallest mountains in the world, including Mount Everest, which is here. Plus, over 100 different ethnic groups call Nepal home, each with different languages and customs. You may have started to get a sense of what that looks like with my description of the Snake Festival. So this is Kathmandu. It is one of 5 cities in a valley known as Kathmandu Valley. So people often refer to just the entire area, including all 5 cities, just as Kathmandu. The whole area is surrounded by these incredibly beautiful forested hills, many of which are part of a national park. And when you look at this scene, I think it looks like it goes on forever. But you might be surprised to hear that just about 40 years ago, almost none of this infrastructure was here. The entire valley was basically farmland. And in just 1 or 2 generations, it completely transformed. So here are some maps that my research partner Purnima made, and which show the growth of the city. So this shape, sort of an irregularly shaped valley with a bowl and then this little elongated part, but that's Kathmandu Valley. And this inner bit is the core city. So the red area on these maps is the built up area, which includes houses, apartment buildings, offices, roads, and that type of infrastructure. So by making these maps, we found that in just 30 years, the amount of the built up area, or the red area that you can see on this map, increased by 625%. That makes Kathmandu one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And so because of this rapid growth, you find a lot of places like this. So in the middle of a really dense residential neighborhood, you can find small farms with crops or livestock like this cow, or you can find massive factories and industrial centers. Because of this, you also have problems with water access. So there in this city, there's very limited green space. And just 40 years ago, there was not. So when the city grew, all of the areas that used to be places where water could seep into the ground were covered over by buildings and concrete. And so Nepal has a monsoon climate. So every summer during the monsoon, the rainwater, which was extremely beneficial for sustaining things like paddy cultivation, now sits on the road and causes severe flooding. So this is a really crazy situation because just in this one city, you can find people whose homes are both underwater, but they are also struggling to get water to do things like their laundry, for example. And so this set of images illustrates this pretty well. So the one on the left here, this shows a paddy cultivation, and then this is a public tap for getting water. And so at these taps, the water isn't supplied 24 hours a day, and there's no faucet. So you have to wait for the limited time when the water is going to come. And so people like sort of line up their jars and their buckets. And then when the water starts flowing, people come back and they'll fill up their bottles, things like that. And so when I came to this tap, people said they had been waiting for close to 2 hours. The water was 2 hours late. And so, but this shows you when you see the paddy, it's extremely green and it's a very water intensive crop. So you know that this area has a lot of water resources, and yet people are waiting over 2 hours just to fill up a couple of buckets. And then this picture on the right was taken maybe 100 yards away, just down the street. And this shows after an intense rainfall, which is very common in the monsoon, the street is entirely flooded. This street was a bit under construction, but it was still like a street that was in use, and it was impassable due to the water. And even streets that aren't sort of like don't have this debris of the road still experience this, even to a more intense degree as well. So being from Missouri, I had never experienced water scarcity. I had read about it in places like National Geographic, and the image that I had in my mind was one of people carrying buckets through remote and rural places. And that does happen all over the world, including in Nepal. Globally, more than 1.2 billion people live in water insecure areas. But there are two types of water scarcity: economic and physical. So physical scarcity is when there's not enough water in the environment to meet the needs of the population. And that's what you see like in the American West, like in Colorado, for example. But there's another type of water insecurity, and that's economic, which is when there is enough of the resource, but because of the way that water is managed, the demand is not met. And this is what happens in Nepal. So you can see this region with the dark blue is economic water scarcity, which is also what affects most of Africa. And so this could be a lack of regulation, insufficient policy, aging infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, lack of economic investment, all contribute to this form of water insecurity. So Kathmandu Valley, which was previously an agricultural center, like I mentioned, that is now home to over 6 million people, faces economic water scarcity. The average person uses less than 50 liters of water every day, which is the UN standard for personal and domestic use. And to give you, to kind of contextualize this, the average American uses about 350 liters a day, and that's not including people who own things like swimming pools. So although most residents of Kathmandu must think about their water use every day, like I mentioned before, they live in the city that is prone to flooding, is extremely water rich with rivers and streams, and sits over a massive underground aquifer. And so I didn't really have any understanding of this when I arrived in Kathmandu the first time in 2018. But it was coming across this scene actually that really struck me. So it was really my first day of school in Nepal. My Nepali older brother was walking me through the city. It was about a mile walk from my house to my school. And Kathmandu is extremely chaotic. So he was like, I'm gonna walk you there on the first day. And so this was right when we were approaching the school, we came across this exact scene. And I looked at him, I was like, what's going on here? And he was like, oh, this is how people have to get water in the city. So these families here live in an area just sort of down the road where even though it's a formal settlement, it's a legitimate neighborhood. There are no pipelines, there are no roads, even though it's in the middle of Kathmandu. And so they have no ability to access water at their houses. And so every about 10 days, I learned this tanker truck comes to deliver potable water, and people bring as many buckets as possible, and that's their drinking water for the week. And so seeing this, I couldn't stop thinking about this after I came across this event. And so I continued looking into it when I was a study abroad student, and then after as a National Geographic grantee. And really, I've been studying urban resource management and resilience planning ever since. So in the US, I, and maybe you all are the same way, I never really thought about where my water was coming from. So, you turn on the tap and it's always there. It's consistently, you can count on it consistently. But in Kathmandu, as I've sort of alluded to, that does not happen. So the government does supply water. There is a municipal water service. That's through like a formal pipe network, like you would find in any city in the US or anywhere in the US, really. But due to like poor infrastructure and a lack of resources, the government cannot supply every house water 24 hours a day, every day. And so, in fact, people actually only, even the houses that get the most water from the government, typically receive water about every 4 days for just 2 hours at a time. So you're really getting almost nothing. And so at that time, you know when it's happening. The government distributes water schedules, and it's based on the ward and where your house is within the ward of the city. And so every month you get a schedule that says when the water will be coming. But unfortunately, it's almost always late. And so you have to be at home waiting for the water to come. And so as you can see, this man, so when you hear like your neighbor's pumps turn on, that's what most people do. They wait for to hear the pump noise, and then everyone runs out to their yard. And you try to fill as many buckets as possible in the 2-hour window that you have. But even most houses actually don't receive water that frequently. Some, it's as infrequent as every 10 days. And so with that amount, you're not even getting enough to shower every day. And so everybody has to find an alternative source. It's also, even though it's government, the water is distributed by the government, it's not potable. And so even with like a ton of filtration, people still get sick pretty much yearly, at least, from a waterborne disease. So because of this, people have to use a combination of different water sources. And so my own homestay family is a good example. So my house got no water from the government. It's just one of those things where the pipe network, even though we were in a very dense area of the city, the pipe network just did not come to my street in particular. And so my family has a well where they were able to get all of their water from. So sometimes it would be in like, we would typically use an electric pump, but sometimes we'd have to hand pump the well and fill up buckets to bring upstairs for showering and cooking, that kind of thing. And so I did some water testing, and found that our well water was actually quite clean, which is rare in Kathmandu, but it still wasn't clean enough to drink. And so we could cook with it, we could shower with it, we could wash our clothes, but it was not potable. And so we would have to buy these bottles from a shop just down the street from my house, at least a few times a week. And so even though we were all drinking this filtered bottled water, we also all became sick at least one point over a year from a waterborne disease. And so the options that I was mentioning before, the tankers, the government water, the jars, and even having a well, is typically restricted to people who are middle and upper class. That's kind of the reason for that is because some of those sources are fairly expensive. Purchasing the bottled water makes up a pretty substantial portion of people's monthly income. And so it's not feasible for people who are lower socioeconomic status. And I'll go into this a bit more later in the presentation, but things like well water and tanker water is also limited to people of higher classes because of the social networks and systems that work in Kathmandu. And so because of this, people who are lower socioeconomic status have to spend the most time waiting for their water. So like this family, for example, is waiting at a community tap. And these taps are like between 500 and 1,500 years old on average. They were the original water network for Kathmandu, and they tap into the shallow aquifer system. The ancient inhabitants of the city were extremely aware of their environment and both the limitations and the availability of resources. And so they were able to build these stone taps that people still use today in the exact same way, which I think is really cool. The unfortunate part is extremely weak. And so this family had to wait there for a few hours. And this is pretty standard, which unfortunately perpetuates inequality because these people who already are like lower socioeconomic status now have to spend hours of their day at the public tap, which prevents them from like having free time or like working a second job or just like even going to school in the case of some like younger children. So you might be able to hear so far that this work is pretty personal to me. I experienced the ways that water intersects with life in Nepal and the implications of water scarcity very firsthand. So this is a picture of my Nepali homestay family when we went on a pilgrimage to a temple high in the Himalayas. I was barred from entering my own kitchen sometimes due to beliefs about purity and contamination that are part of the Hindu faith. I also got an intestinal worm that my Nepali sister named Ramesh after herself. Ramesh also had a few friends, unfortunately. I also worried about dengue fever during the monsoon season, and I also showered with a bucket to reduce my water consumption. But I will say that this work is personal to me more than all of those things because of the way that my friends and my family in Nepal cope with the challenges that come from water insecurity, the daily tensions, and the neighborhood conflicts every single day. And at the same time, they strive to make things better. So one of my friends who's a good example of this is named Purnima. So Purnima moved to Kathmandu about 15 years ago from a small town in a western region of the country. So her family was displaced during the Nepal Civil War, which happened about 2 decades ago. And so their family came to Kathmandu looking for more opportunity and a more safe environment away from the militant groups. And so when they arrived in Kathmandu, they knew that there was a water problem. And so they were trying to find an apartment, and each place that they would visit to see if it was the one they wanted to rent, their first question would always be, how's the water here? And so that's actually ultimately how they made their decision, was solely based on water availability. And so, but even despite this fact that their building was known to be like a water secure building in a water secure region of the city, they still had very little agency because they were migrant tenants. And so they were coming from a different place in Nepal. They were Nepali, spoke Nepali, but they still faced discrimination due to their migrant status. And so they wanted to move. They did not want to be renters forever. And so they started looking for a place to build a home outside of the city in a more suburban area. And so they found a plot of land, and there were just a couple houses clustered around. It was mostly farmland, and they decided to build their own home. And so they chose the neighborhood, again, based on water availability. They heard it was a suburb that had a lot of water. They heard that the groundwater was plentiful and really clean, so they could bore a well, and they built their home. And this is extremely common. So common in Kathmandu, in fact, that the entire suburb has now been built up, and it's filled with people who are in the exact same position as her family had once been in. Her entire suburb is made up of people who moved from a western region of Nepal due to the Civil War, also coming to that specific place to looking for water. And so her neighborhood, though, has also changed in another way. Her well water, which is the source of her entire family's, all of their water needs, has become contaminated. And every year they notice it a little bit more. So now, even with extensive filtration and purification, they still can't actually use it at all. And so now she said her family feels like what option do we have anymore? So things can get a little bit dire. And this is what I study. I wanted to understand the social, cultural, and structural reasons that people experience water scarcity differently in different parts of Kathmandu, to then ask, what can we do to make the city more sustainable? So because Kathmandu is massive, I focused on just a few neighborhoods. The ones that I chose, Gongabu, Budhanilkanta, and Mulpani, are just outside of the core area of the city, which is demarcated by the ring road here. And I chose these specifically because they are areas of the highest growth rate. So most migrants, when they come here, come to Kathmandu, move to those regions. So most of my work was interview-based. So I spent a ton of time talking with government officials and scientists. And I also spent a lot of time just walking around these neighborhoods and chatting with the people that I would meet along the way. It's important to note, though, that this was not a solo effort. I worked with an amazing research team at an organization called the Small Earth Nepal, and they are an environmental research group based in Kathmandu. It was not all female, but we did have a really awesome team of female scientists, which was really great to see, especially in a pretty patriarchal place like Nepal. So for the rest of the presentation, I am going to continue sharing some stories of the people that I met, specifically on this slide, to demonstrate some of what it's like to be a Kathmanduite, to live in Nepal, and to face water scarcity. So this is a picture of my Nepali family's hometown, Mulabari in Dading district. You can see on this map that Dading is very central Nepal. And their village was about probably like a 4-hour bus ride and then maybe a 4-hour walk. There were no paved roads, so we had to walk up to the village. So Dading is known to be quite rural. And we went to their village specifically for Mahashivaratri, which is a holiday that's celebrated across Nepal. It's a Hindu holiday, but it's especially important in Dading. And so my Nepali family would often tell me that life was better in the village. And they say that they sort of miss, one, the old ways of life, the sense of community, the sense of being surrounded by nature, and also just sort of the way that things were plentiful there. The Dading specifically is very agrarian. It's covered in terraced hills that are all used for farmlands. There's lots of livestock, lots of rivers. It's extremely beautiful. So one woman that I interviewed in Kathmandu, who's also from Dading, said, if other places in Nepal were developed, no one would want to come to Kathmandu. She said, once I get the opportunities, she was living in Kathmandu at the time, once I get the opportunities I need here, I will definitely move back to my village in Dading. I will go home because, as you can see in Kathmandu, the facilities and the development is nothing here. Only the people in high positions ever get any access. So this is a good example of what the infrastructure looks like in Kathmandu. And Mamta's, the woman I interviewed, her statement is also extremely common in Kathmandu. So people often come to the capital city looking for better facilities, which includes improved access to clean water, regular electricity, which you cannot find in Dading, and regular medical care, and then also for education and work opportunities. But they end up often feeling like these things are out of reach due to their status or economic situation. And as you can see from this picture, the development in Kathmandu is extremely haphazard. So these hoses are either legal or illegal connections to the municipal pipeline. So people will, each neighborhood that's off of the main line will get to attach a hose. And most of the time it is legal, but sometimes people do sort of bend the rules a bit. And this causes a lot of problems because if you're closer to the source of the pipe, you're going to have pretty regular access. If you're at the end of the pipe with all of these external connections, even if you're connected to the government supply, like for example, my own homestay family, you're probably not going to get any water just because it's all going to have been taken before it gets to the end of the pipe. So, there are many other factors on it. So there are lots of different factors. One is where you live in the valley. So like an example, whether you live close to a source or far away from the source. If you live in a wealthier area or a more industrial area. If you live in a more established neighborhood versus a new one that's more where a lot of migrants live. Another factor is who makes up your social network. Nepal is an extremely social society, I would say, and how you access different things is entirely based on who you know, your friends, and the connections that you've made. It also is dependent on your caste, and caste-based discrimination is illegal, but it definitely persists. And finally, if you are a tenant or a landlord, and I'll go into that a bit more. So this woman is named Sona. She works as a teacher, and she does private tutoring in her spare time to make some extra money. She says that she spends all of her additional income on clean water. It ends up being thousands of rupees a week, which is the equivalent of like 10 US dollars, which is pretty substantial in Kathmandu. And so this is an extremely large proportion of her salary. But she says that she's happy to spend that money because it means that when she gets home from working long days at school, she doesn't have to spend all night filtering her well water or ordering her life around the government water schedules, which wouldn't be feasible for her since she's away from home at school all day. And so instead, she buys truckloads of water that come to her house weekly, and it from like a private source. And so that way she can spend time pursuing her real passion, which is writing poetry. And so in Nepal, that means a lot of people have to make this choice. Like, are they going to get water? Are they going to spend all their money, or are they going to get to write? And, you know, it's an interesting, it's kind of hard when you're like, okay, I get to choose between writing and having enough water. Most people don't have the luxury of choosing writing. And so Sona says that because of this, she's extremely fortunate. This woman is Sam Adikari's daughter-in-law. So when Sam was young, Sam was about, I think he was about 80. When Sam was young, he would go with his mother to take the goats out to graze. And one day he was just sort of digging around in the dirt when he found water coming up out of the ground from this little hole he had created. And so this neighborhood that he lived in was actually called Mulpani, which was one of my study sites. And the word Mulpani means source of water. And so it was named for the springs that would pop up all over the region. And so his family built that spring into a formal tap, which is what you see here. And he says that because of this, because they did that service to the community, that they're blessed with infinite water. And so his daughter-in-law, I guess, took me to see the site. He was too old to walk down there now. And when we got there, she started ranting. She was like, he only has this water because I do all the work. He doesn't know the challenges we actually face. This town area is called Mulpani, but even here in this place that's known for having water, in fact, is named after it, has no water. And so their neighbor actually had already moved twice in search of better water access. And they say their next move, they'll leave Kathmandu. They'll just go back to their village. This is Susmina. Susmina works for a bottled water company, like I was mentioning before. And so these private organizations have grown so much that people in Kathmandu say that life wouldn't even be possible in the city without them. Ironically, though, their high extraction rate, so most of these companies are pulling from the aquifers. So their high extraction volume is causing some of the local household wells to go dry. And so there's an ongoing battle between these private water companies and their neighbors. So most of them are situated just sort of in the middle of residential areas. There isn't much zoning in Kathmandu, so there's no like single use residential area. And so this causes all the people who surround the water companies who depend on well water to lose their water access. So like I was saying before, these bottled water companies also the water that people buy from these is universally accepted as clean, which isn't always the case. A lot of business owners bribe government officials so that they pass the water quality standards tests. And in fact, they cause a lot of illness. And so because water companies are causing household wells to go dry, people have to continue boring deeper wells and to try to tap into the rapidly depleting groundwater table. So this man is, this is what boring a well looks like. And people will spend a ton of money to bore a deeper well, sometimes like even as deep as 500 feet deep, just to find it go dry months or months later. And so additionally, groundwater access, so like who gets to use the well, is typically restricted to landowners. And so tenants have to collect water more frequently from public sources and spend more time at community taps, which perpetuates social and economic inequality. And so one thing that I should mention about how houses are structured in Nepal, in Kathmandu, there are almost no single family homes. Like I don't think I saw a single one. And so either it will be one family, but it will be multi-generational. So people will have 3 or 4 generations in the home. And so it would be like at least between 5 and 15 people, let's say, with that span the 3 generations. Or more typically, you have one family that owns the building, and most buildings are like 3 to 4 stories. And the landowning building will live on the top floor. And then the tenant families will live on the other floors. But this can cause problems because the buildings it's not like a formal apartment building like you would find in the US. So you can't go in and lock your door or whatever. It just is a house, and each floor is completely open access to anybody who lives in the home. It's just where the tenants are just placed on the ground floor. And then sort of bedrooms are made in a room that might not necessarily have been intended for a bedroom. And so even in my own homestay house, my family owned the building, and they resided on the top 2 floors. And then the ground floor there were 2 tenant families, each got 1 room, and then they shared a bathroom. So because you're in this like close proximity you're between the tenants and the landowners, it can cause a ton of tension if the owning family is saying like, oh, you live, the well is outside of your door, but you can't use it. And that's pretty common. And it's not really seen as a form of, people aren't doing it maliciously. It's just more about who has water access, but it does cause a lot of social tension. So this man's name is Shay Carr. He was the head engineer of a government project to divert one of the major rivers of Nepal to funnel water down into Kathmandu. And so this was known as a national pride project that was formulated about 30 years ago to remedy the water problems that existed even then. He was actually badly injured in a construction incident at the site when there was a failure at the pipeline. And because of that, it's been more than 20 years since the projected end date, and the project is still not finished. And this has caused a ton of frustration. People often say now, even when the water lines are finished and there are no incidences which continue to happen, unfortunately, the water really is only going to serve the wealthy. And so people say the damage has already been done. The plans, these water plans, it's just paperwork. And so part of that project was meant to bring more water to the city to flesh out the major river in Kathmandu, the Bagmati. And the Bagmati River is one of the holiest places in Kathmandu, but it unfortunately now functions sort of like a public sewer. But the issue is that almost every Hindu in every province that surrounds Kathmandu is brought to Kathmandu to be cremated on the banks of the Bagmati. That's sort of how sacred it's known to be across the country. So my own Nepali family spent 13 days. When your family member dies and they're cremated, you have to spend 13 days living right beside the river, and they kind of right next to the sewer. And so they said that they have thought about not even cremating relatives there in the future, because they think that with all the pollution, God does not reside in the river anymore. And so I think I painted a pretty dire picture, and it is. but I had originally named my project Waiting for Water. And now I know that that does not describe what is happening. People are not passively waiting for things to get better with their water situation, not at all. And so there's an emphasis on things like conservation and education. There are also a lot of farming projects. So this is mostly a group of female smallholders. We worked with about 50 female smallholders in a suburb of Kathmandu. Even though this looks quite agricultural, it's still part of Kathmandu city. And we worked with them to implement a drip irrigation project and soil revitalization campaign. This man's name is KP. He built a water system at his home that ensures that not a single drop is wasted in his entire household system. And he does this through a combination of rainwater harvesting, gray water reuse, recharge wells, and gardening. And so he now has so much water that his neighbors will come to him in times of scarcity, asking for some of his. And he says that God has given him so much that it's his duty to give some away and teach others about what they can do as well. So his backyard has been transformed into a local water conservation teaching center. And so back to the snake festival known as Nag Panchami. So for weeks leading up to the festival, my Nepali brother Dinesh would spend all day at the pond. He and a group of other volunteers would clean it, conduct maintenance on some of the aerators and the ancient underground canal system that feeds the pond. And they would also ensure that the taps that surrounded the pond were clean and accessible to anyone that needed them. And so there is an entire social structure built around the groups that preserve and protect the water systems of Kathmandu. And this is a really big way that people are approaching the water crisis. People realize that they can't rely on the government, they can't really rely on policy to make water more accessible. And so what they're doing is reviving the traditional infrastructure that continues to play a major role in daily life by showing that this infrastructure can play two functions, the ritual and the technical. And so in some ways, water and the lack of it has meaning for people that is always present. Sometimes that's on the surface, and sometimes it's more subtle. For some people, it dictates much of the routines of their daily lives. And for some, it's more of a minor annoyance, like for Sona, the teacher who had to pay more money. For some people, it's a financial burden. And for others still, it's the crux of an argument against the government and corruption. I guess corruption, I didn't mention this before, but corruption is a big reason why water is distributed unequally throughout the city. And so water insecurity in Kathmandu strains relationships between neighbors and friends. It causes people to question decisions they have made for their families in the face of social pressures. So even moving to Kathmandu has become, people doubt their decisions to do so purely based on water. And it also has reshaped religious and cultural practices, like in the case of how people worship the Bagmati River and the turning away from that due to the pollution. And so water scarcity in Kathmandu causes hopelessness and resignation, but it also spurs resiliency and innovation, like with KP and his rainwater harvesting systems. So I want to conclude by emphasizing that doing field work and living in Nepal was so much more than just doing research all the time. It was also an important part of my job, but also like an important part of just living there to learn about daily life by being a part of it. And honestly, that was my favorite part of my job. So like I said, I lived with a Nepali homestay family. And so I spent tons of time with them, participating in different festivals and religious events, traveling, going on pilgrimages, and really just hanging out, watching TV, cooking, chatting. Those are some of my favorite parts of life in Nepal. So another fun story is that my Nepali older brother is a professional boxer. And so every morning he would teach me at his gym how to box. And so it was things like that that made life in Nepal really full of surprises and new experiences. It was definitely challenging at times, living so far away from home and kind of constantly being pushed out of my comfort zone. But it was also the most incredible year of learning and getting new perspectives that I could ever imagine. So I want to just thank you all again for listening. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. And I'm really happy I got to share about my work. So I think we have a couple minutes for questions. I'm okay to go a couple minutes over time if we have a few. And I'm more than happy to answer anything.
Thank you so much, Madison. That was super interesting and so well told. So thank you. For everyone who has a question and hasn't yet put it in the chat or Q&A section at the bottom, I want to encourage you to do so. We do have some here, but if you have one lingering, go ahead and ask it. From the top, we have a question. Can you boil the water for cooking?
Yes, you can. It's difficult because the water does contain a lot of heavy metals, unfortunately, which part of that is naturally occurring. There's like the aquifer is like a two-tiered aquifer. So there's a shallow and then like an impermeable surface and then the lower. Just because of the I don't know, geography of the area, the lower aquifer has naturally occurring heavy metals, which are not, they can cause health problems. And so people have found that that's the case. In some cases, yes, in some cases, no.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a few compliments rolling in. Outstanding presentation, very informative and eye-opening.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Did your host family speak English?
No. So I started learning Nepali when I was there as a study abroad student. And then I spent the next year and a half while I was finishing college, continuing to learn. And then I took lessons again when I was there as a National Geographic grantee. So I worked with a private tutor like 3 days a week and did all of my work in Nepali.
That's super cool.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thankfully, it's conversationally not a very hard language. Written, it's extremely hard. But I also worked with a research partner who could help facilitate some of the more difficult conversations. And then my Nepali family was a great place to practice. And so, yeah, it was a lot of time pointing and kind of just gesturing for what I needed. But eventually, yeah, I got to the point where we could have really awesome conversations.
Super cool. So from the beginning of the presentation, when you were in the boat and the women or one of the women ended up in the pond, this question here is asking, how clean do you think that pond water is? And is it a concern at all to be in it?
So, I mean, I guess from the pictures, it probably didn't look that clean. There definitely was, some algae growth, but I don't think it was unsafe for people to be swimming. It's definitely not meant for that. But yeah, to my knowledge, it wouldn't cause any health effects. But it certainly wouldn't be used for drinking. So these ponds, Kathmandu has like an indigenous group called like the Newar community. And so my Nepali family is, for example, is part of that community. And the Newars built these, like a lot of times they like kind of look like cisterns and like about 1,000 years ago. And so typically they include like a pond and then off to the side, like a public tap. And so the pond is for rainwater harvesting, and which helps in the monsoon, like it reduces the risk of floods. And then the public taps come from a different source. So and typically the contaminated water doesn't get into the public taps too often.
Yeah. Another question here is regarding the man who found the spring from the ground. And it says, if the woman said that it was so difficult, why did he think it was easy to get that water? What was that situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it can be difficult because the situation is changing extremely rapidly. So people who had extremely plentiful access to water, maybe their well was just overflowing, even like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, often find that it's completely dry now. And so it can be harder, especially for people who are older and have grown up in a community that's like known as a place where there is just always water. So like that man, for example, like every day he would go down to the creek behind his house, and that's where he would like do his religious practice and bathe, things like that. And so when people like have this assumption about the area, it can be really hard to like kind of reframe your perspective, because it's weird to like go from like thinking that you live in this place that's just full of water to living in what's basically a desert, in the span of 5 years. And so, yeah, it can be kind of hard to rationalize that. And then typically in Nepali society, women do most of the labor, including like the hard labor, which is surprising. You don't find that in a lot of countries. And so women are typically the ones who are like carrying really heavy loads, doing the farm work, doing things like water collection, which is like really labor intensive because the buckets are really heavy. And so typically men have less of an understanding of like what kind of access they have because they actually aren't there at the source.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Did flushing the toilet require a bucket of water?
Sometimes. We like definitely there were times when like the tanker that we hired at my house like didn't come. You know, you don't really know why, just wouldn't show up. And so we definitely like sort of started to run out of water sometimes. And then in those cases, yeah, we would have to use a bucket to flush it manually, sort of. But most of the time that wasn't necessary. I will say though that like we had like a formal piped sewage system. A lot of people do not, and so you do like it would be more of like a whole. This is like if you have an outhouse, and then yeah, you just flush it manually. Yeah.
When you got sick, what was your treatment like?
I got sick a lot. It just happens. I went to the hospital and got some antibiotics, got some other, I don't know, some like antiparasitics, just kind of like a standard like medical system. You can definitely like I chose to go to like the hospital that's like known for like for foreigners. It's like the climbing hospital for all the mountaineers, just because I didn't want to take any chances with like not getting adequate treatment, which thankfully I had that ability to do so. Most people don't. But a lot of people, like my homestay family, really would rely a lot on like traditional medicine. So they would drink a lot of teas. They would see like a ritual healer. That was really common. But I just chose to get standard antibiotics.
Cool. This is kind of a big question. What solutions do you envision to improve the water access issue?
Oh, that's really hard.
You were just identifying.
Yeah, I wish it was an easy question to answer. The biggest problem in Nepal, I think it requires three things. One, it requires like everybody in the country has to come to Kathmandu for anything. So they're trying to go away from that now with like they created a federalist system a few years ago, and divided the country into 7 like geographic regions. Each one now has a capital. And so they're trying to build up those capitals. But before, like, even if you wanted to like get a passport, for example, you had to come to Kathmandu. And so for some people that could be like, it could take 3 days, 6 days even, if you had to walk a lot to get to a road. And so people would just like, a lot of young people and a lot of elderly people move to Kathmandu. And so not that depopulating the city is a good answer, but making it, so the first stage of this is like making other areas of the city, of the country, more attractive, because right now it's so dense. It's actually denser than New York. And so the density plus the lack of infrastructure is like almost impossible to address. So first, like making other places have more opportunity is key. Like I think it's something like the past couple of decades, like 1 million people move there every year. And it's just like a lot of people aren't counted in the 6 million census because they don't count migrants. And so, but majority of people, it's like 50% of people are migrants. So that can get really challenging. So that's big. Then I think creating like having more regulation for zoning, so there's more open space. Currently in Kathmandu, in the dense areas, like you can't find a single like blade of grass even. And so there's no way for the aquifer to recharge, and almost everyone depends on groundwater. And so making sure that the aquifer is has sufficient recharge capability is extremely important. They made the like main recharge area of the city a national park, which was a huge move. And that was for the protection of the aquifer. But even that, it's like not enough at all. And so I think a lot of people are suggesting for things like pocket parks, like any open space possible, making it a green space, which would really help with like public health. It would help with mental health, and it would help with water access. So that kind of thing would be great. And there is a lot of like unused infrastructure that could easily be turned into green space. But the problem is it requires investment, and Nepal doesn't have a lot of resources. And that's kind of the third thing. So increasing like prioritization of the infrastructure and repairs. So currently, like I think 40% of the piped water is lost to leaks before it even makes it to people's homes. And so 40% is huge. And most of the infrastructure is at least 100 years old. There's not been any investment in replacing the pipes. And so things like that would make a big difference too. And then finally, having like an integrated policy framework that combines land use and water conservation. Right now, the two are really siloed. And so there's no overlap. Nobody talks, like the water sector doesn't talk with the land use sector. But in reality, like they're so intertwined that having those things under one formal legislative body would be so key in how to reform policy.
Absolutely. Wow. That was a great answer. Thank you.
Oh, cool.
And then 2 questions that are a little bit less centered around water. But what's Nepal's relationship with tourism?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people know about Nepal in the context of tourism. And when I talk about like I lived in Nepal, everybody, 100% of people ask me if I've been to Everest, which is a natural question. I'd be curious. I ask people that have been to Nepal too, like, oh, was it because you were going to Everest? And so I think there's this perception that the country is extremely tourist dependent. And in a sense it is. I think tourism makes up like about 15% of the GDP, which is substantial, but it's not everything. So, and the rest is agricultural, and or like some small industry, like in Kathmandu. And so it's hard because the tourists, like, it does bring a lot of economic opportunity, but also causes a lot of environmental degradation. And like in the case of like the Sherpa communities in the mountain regions, there's like the villages have almost no men, because like a lot of them have died. The death rate among Sherpas is extremely high. And so it creates this really complicated dynamic where people, especially in these mountain regions where there's like very little economic opportunity, other than like livestock, like pastoralism, there's a dependence on foreign tourists to support the local economies, but also it causes like a large percentage of the population to die young, and which also like increases the burden on women in the villages to do more farming. So it's a hard cycle. It's also causing water quality degradation even in remote areas. It's interesting though, like most Nepali people don't care about the tourists, about the mountains. Like in Kathmandu, most people have never been to the mountains and they have like no desire to go. There's not the culture of mountain climbing there, which like sounds like there would be, because that's kind of what we think of as like Americans thinking about Nepal. But yeah, I asked my 9 Nepali family about going trekking, going to Everest, and they were like, oh, like why would we do that? That doesn't sound fun at all. So the one thing that's interesting now is that like one generation ago, so people who are like currently in their like, let's say 40s or 50s, there was no, people didn't take vacations, people did not travel. Now there's a culture of internal tourism, which I think is really cool. A lot of like younger Nepali people are wanting to explore the country more, for leisure, not just for economic and educational opportunity. So that's really huge. And it's also helping people just like have a broader perspective of what the country has to offer and what their capabilities are. So that's really cool.
Absolutely. And you kind of answered this other question here that asks about like if women are the ones doing much of the work, like you previously mentioned, what is the role of men in society?
Yeah, it's difficult because women do most of the work, and men hold almost all of the power, even at a very localized level, even at the household level. So like, I mean, even I faced discrimination for being a woman, like even within my own house. And like, I was extremely close and continue to be extremely close with my Nepali family members, but that's, it's really so ingrained. And so it's a lot less explicit now, I've heard. You see like a lot of female scientists, for example, but that almost only happens in Kathmandu, and in other regions of the country. The literacy rate is extremely low among women. Even though like women are often the primary like income earners, like in the market with farming, they don't control how money is spent in their households, which like studies have shown makes a huge difference on economic opportunities just in general for a country. If women have more control over the finances, surprisingly. I mean, not surprisingly, but it's surprising how much of a difference it makes. So things like that. Yeah, there are a lot of like patriarchy. It's definitely a patriarchal society.
And then I have one question personally, just to round things out. How has your relationship to water personally changed after having all of this information on Nepal's water scarcity?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because I never thought about it before. it just was something that, you know, really never came up for me. Now, like, I don't know, like I read books for fun about like the Colorado River because it's like, oh, I need to know about even like my new local community of like living in Boulder. Like I need to know about this. So I study urban resilience, and water is a really key part of that. I like joke sometimes with my mom, like a few years ago, I was like, because I had been doing this project now for like 4 years, I guess. And I joked at one point, like early on, I was like, if I'm still like working on water issues in 5 years, like you have to make me quit. I cannot continue this. This is so frustrating. And now I've kind of been like, oh, actually, like, this is my career. Like, don't tell me to quit now. It's in a year because like too late now. So yeah, it shapes a lot of the decisions I make, personally and professionally. So yeah, it's a pretty big driver of things now.
Absolutely. We have one last comment here. The NPR program 1A today was all about water scarcity and the concerns around the Colorado River. Sorry for
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, there are some great books about Colorado River as well. Where the Water Goes is a great one. But yeah, the Colorado River is such a complicated system. I'll have to listen to what they were saying. Yes, I think it's Where the Water Goes by David Owen. He like tracks the entire path and goes through the history of water rights, and how people can call on their rights and when they can't. Yeah, it's really interesting.
That will conclude our travelogue for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for supporting the work of the Geographic Society of Chicago. And thank you so much, Madison, for all of the information that you shared with us.